This is the second of a two-part podcast on healing. Last time we talked about the concept of deism and its impact on Western Christian thinking. We talked about its view that God had wound the world up and left it to its own devices, and also its separation of what is natural from what is supernatural. We also talked about the response of the Pentecostal and charismatic traditions that highlight God's closeness and intervention. We said that both of these responses were not comprehensive enough, and we started to suggest that healing could be better encapsulated in three words. The first of these was the word discernment. In this podcast, we will highlight two further words that help us think more helpfully about what healing means today. And I want to share a story of healing from my own experience. This is Dchurched.com. My name is Jools. Welcome. The second of our three words is the word macro. This is a Greek word which has been used in English now, meaning length or possibly breadth in Greek, and tends to be used of time in Greek as well. In English, it has come to mean something that's larger or wider. In other words, if we use the word macro, we're giving this sense of the idea of a bigger story going on. The story is not about me, myself, and I. It's about the big story of how God is relating to the world and the whole cosmos. So firstly, I want to say, have a wider view of healing. What does that look like? Well, it says that God is a healing God. In the Gospels, healing is a word that's almost synonymous with the word salvation at times. At the end of Revelation, it talks about the healing of the nations. But when we think of healing, we only tend to think of the healing of individuals or of physical healing. And the Bible, however, talks about the whole of creation awaiting healing. Those individuals who are healed are just foretastes of that coming day. Even recovery of the most spectacular type, for example, from a terminal illness, is just a sign of a bigger story. The sign is not the reality. The reality is still to come. If I'm going on holiday, I don't get excited by road signs to the place I'm visiting. Instead, I eagerly await the place itself. And in the famous words from a famous movie, I will say, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" So macro says to us, it's not primarily about us as individuals when we think about healing, but a far bigger story, a huge story involving the whole cosmos, seen and unseen. And when you have that view, it also widens the concept of healing. It's not just physical healing. It can be healing of how we do our business or education. It can be healing within the local community, groups perhaps that build good in the local community and build love and relationship. It can be healing of the body politic, and God knows we need some of that. Desmond Tutu took that seriously in his opposition to the apartheid movement. He was a man of deep prayer, but also a social and political activist. He helped bring healing to his country both during and after those traumatic years. His ministry anticipated the healing of the nations. Is South Africa perfect? Far from it. Has it descended into tribalism in the way other African nations did after colonialism? No, it hasn't. And Tutu has played a role in that, mostly for the good. I suspect Tutu would say that healing is not merely charity or community or activist work. Any person of good intent, but with no particular spirituality, can do that. No, it must be work born out of a deep place of prayer. So think of healing in this macro sense, this big story. When we think of healing in this way, it also places us in the scheme of things. We are not the only creatures unhealed. The reality is that even those healed will still eventually die. And all of us have bodies that are decaying. But the resurrection gives us hope that it will not always be so. But as part of creation, we still wait on the bigger story to unveil itself. Romans 8 says that literally all creation is on tiptoe, straining to see over the horizon for the future revealing of God's purposes and plans. We may not be healed because we're part of this creation that longs for its renewal, the creation that is subject to frustration and decay. We're not immune. We're not healed, perhaps because all creation is not healed yet. As Paul puts it, our bodies still wear out like fraying tent ropes. We join with all creation in longing for the healing of the nations. So have a wider view, one that encompasses the whole of God's plan for the whole earth, and have a longer term view with that as well. The story is not over if things go wrong. We've read the end of the book and it says full healing is coming. So, first two words, learn discernment and have a macro perspective. Now let's go in the opposite direction, micro. We had macro before, now let's think of the word micro. Let's go small in our perspective. The charismatics want an interventionist God, and that's good. But sometimes in practice, healing is defined only in ways that seem extraordinary, the unexplainable, and it's called, quote, the supernatural. Ironically, that's still buying into some of the categories of deism. Remember what deism said? God has left the world to run itself. There is a natural order of things that doesn't require God. The natural order is by definition not supernatural. It's natural. God isn't involved at all. It's a natural occurrence, we say. Or if you've been part of some Pentecostal traditions where it is said, the Spirit really moved last week, but it was a bit dull this week. Or God healed someone last week. This week it was a bit more ordinary. I love the story about a lively service where the songs were flowing and there were sighs and hallelujahs and clapping and shouts. And one woman excitedly stood up to pray and said, Lord, you can see that we're having a good time this week, but you should have been here last Sunday. So these categories of the natural and the supernatural, I kind of want to blur. There will always be ordinary and extraordinary things, of course. But let's not buy into the categories of natural and supernatural. All things are permeated with the presence of God, and to a greater or lesser degree, supernatural. This kind of viewpoint held sway right up until really the 16th century, and I kind of want us to recapture it. Now that isn't to argue that earthquakes and famines are a direct activity of God, but it is to say that woven through the fabric of life is divine love. The King is at home in this world. It is the kingdom of our God. If we have eyes to see, we can consider the lilies and the sparrows the way Jesus asked us to do. In that passage, the Greek is to study or gaze intently. And when we do that, we may spot this loving God, if we have eyes to see. Here's how the micro in healing works. Scripture says the Son holds all things together. That includes the smallest cell that repairs itself. It seems to do it as a process without the need for God. There's a Greek word, automate, from which we get the word automatically. And in the Bible, a prison door opened for Paul, automate, apparently all by itself. But would they have viewed it that way? No. Jesus describes how things grow, apparently all by itself. But in the Hebrew worldview, God moves through it all. There is no all by itself in the sense in which we use it. That's a construct of the 17th and 18th century scientific worldview. Implicit deism divides the world into natural healing and supernatural. That's a false dichotomy. There are no natural and supernatural causes. In God, we live and move and have our beings, quotes Paul. When I cut myself and the wounds heal, apparently all by itself, actually it's the hand of the great healer at work who holds my frame, who works in and through my body. Notice healing in the small ways and don't dismiss it as merely natural or even ordinary. The Maker holds all things together, the smallest cell and the fabric of space-time itself. The psalmist says, "Where can I hide from your presence?" And the answer is, of course, nowhere. At all times, he sustains life. Let me finish with my own story of micro-healing that I've experienced in recent times. 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. I wasn't particularly overweight, but what weight I did have decided it would park itself around my vital organs. Very inconsiderate of it, really. I was on metformin tablets for that entire time of 10 years. I lost some weight over those years and tried the 5-2 diet, which helped a little. But 5 months ago, I started missing a meal per day. It's called intermittent fasting. And I avoid a lot of carbs. This makes the body use fat for fuel rather than relying on a regular intake of carbs. I can still eat fairly fatty meals and not put on weight, and I still have the odd piece of chocolate. Good peer-reviewed research says this kind of diet can have all kinds of benefits for blood sugar, brain function, and so on and so forth. Now, I've done this for 5 months, and I don't pretend that I'm all the way there yet, but I've been blown away with the results. My sugar levels are back to normal from which is a drop of 40%. I am now squarely in the non-diabetic range, and I'm off my medication after almost 10 years. Also, I'm off my medication for blood pressure. The drug companies are not going to be happy with me, but I am. Now, to me, this is a form of healing. When I learned how to cooperate with how God made my body, the healing processes kicked in. Or put another way, the Son who holds all things together moved things into gear, holding all things together for my healing. Now, I'm not pretending that if I went back on the carbs, I wouldn't start spiking up again and it would be pretty ordinary. But I can live without the carbs because I can eat lots of other nice things. But here's the thing. At the micro level, the cells in my body have begun to repair in ways they've never been allowed to before. Certainly if we believe the strong scientific evidence that has emerged in recent years, including some that received a Nobel Prize for its work. And yet, for every happy story like mine, for every good story that we can name, the situations of the many are that many are not healed. You know, they're now discovering that trauma, for example, through war can affect the DNA that you pass on to your kids, perhaps even manifesting itself in mental or physical health issues. The web of brokenness in the nature of things is deeper and more profound than we realize. We are part of this broken creation always, even when we are healed. Now imagine that trauma embedded in ourselves over 100 generations. Creation is not what it was meant to be. But here's the hope that Christians have, is a counter-narrative voice that comes from Jesus, the one who can take our woundedness and pain, who can restore and heal at a micro level, at a macro level, and if we're willing to discern in all kinds of surprising ways. Bad theologies of healing have done all kinds of harm to good people. But the answer to bad thinking is not to reject the concept of healing, but to perceive it in its widest facets. Above all, to recognize that God is in the business of bringing healing to our world, but often in ways that seem ordinary and not part of our categories of healing. The concept is just wider and more breathtaking than sometimes we imagined. So don't get caught up with road signs. Let's be like creation, longing for and traveling towards the full healing of the nations. If you've been wounded, if you're living in the brokenness of Good Friday, one day will come the restoration of all things. As individuals, we get to be swept up in that big story. In the meantime, we can all be part of that healing work of the kingdom in a multitude of ways. Some brokenness and healing awaits the coming day. If that's you, we are called to learn how to dwell in Easter Saturday, even if all seems dead and buried. But sometimes Just sometimes we discern that God is moving in extraordinary ways, and we see healing come to individuals, families, or even communities. Signs that say the big Easter Sunday is coming, and it's coming for the whole planet Earth. May you and I see more of that in-breaking healings of the kingdom occur in the societies that we live in. This is Dchurched.com. My name is Jools. Thanks for listening.